I was able to leverage my experience as a member of the marching band into the sequence that included a marching band that was primarily comprised of wildebeests. If I know anything about people in the arts, when they see any kind of representation of what they're into, they get super picky. So I really wanted to make sure that I was, I guess, doing my fellow band members proud by making sure that I was trying to keep those wildebeests as accurate as possible.
Hello, and welcome to episode 72 of the BandWagon podcast for the week of March 2nd, 2026. On this edition of the program, news and notes from the band world, including a story about the First Amendment and consequences, which has a little to do with band, a Randy Standy anecdote, and by popular demand, I have an animated conversation for you. I'm your host, Rob Hammerton. Hello, dear listener. It's been a while. How you doing? I've been busy. Back in November, you may recall, with apologies and gratitude for your understanding, I put the old podcast on a bit of a hiatus. Life was about to get, well, complex, both professionally and personally, and I opted to place the podcast project on a back burner. That metaphor, I think, was apt because, to continue the kitchen analogy, I did not opt to put the podcast in the bin, as they say in the UK. The question was, when would it emerge again? I didn't know, but I figured the answer was when two things happened. One, when life quieted down a bit, and two, when something happened in the world that caused a new podcast episode to become an inevitability. Well, one out of two. And happily for you, it was the second thing that happened. Namely, a little bit of band news, and a whole lot of people encouraging me to have a chat with one particular person in the world who was using her band powers for good. So, for the first time in about 3.5 months, ignore the possibly intruding sounds of the blizzard currently raging outside, even as you consider that I'm recording this indoors. But more importantly, empty your spit valves, and away we go. Let's play the first strain. In this episode's combination first and second strain, you have to know the rules before you can break them, news and notes from the band world. Dateline, Indianapolis, Indiana, and the Internet. In early February, a small company called Marching Health issued this statement on its Facebook page. Quote, Marching Health is in the process of closing operations. This decision was made internally and is not a reflection of the quality, safety, or professionalism of the educators, ensembles, partners, or organizations we have worked with over the years. We are grateful for the trust placed in us and remain proud of the students, directors, and professionals who have been part of this work. We ask that all current and former partners be afforded respect and left out of online speculation or harassment as we complete the transition. Thank you to the marching arts community for the opportunity to serve. Very shortly thereafter, on February 3rd, Drum Corps International issued a statement of its own. Quote, DCI has ended its partnership with Marching Health effective immediately following review of recent social media activity that raised concerns within our community. Their statement continued, quote, as a national organization serving young performers, educators, and leaders, we expect partners to uphold standards of conduct that reflect DCI's values and align with our community code of conduct and ethics. When those standards are not met, we take appropriate action. We have received several emails with concerns and are responding to those directly. We are also monitoring social media activity, including on Reddit. For now, we are not engaging on Reddit or other platforms, as that tends to amplify these situations rather than help resolve them. DCI's statement continued. For background, DCI engaged Marching Health last year after hearing that many corps had a pain point with recruiting athletic trainers. The primary deal point with Marching Health was recruitment of ATCs, as that is not something DCI can easily do on our own. We do have a list of a dozen or so interested medical professionals that came from Marching Health's efforts, and our ensemble service team will continue to vet them. unquote. The very next day, the gentleman who runs the YouTube account called Funliner Productions, whose name I have not been able to ascertain, and for that I apologize, posted a video that discussed lots of details about DCI's decision and what violations of their ethical standards they were responding to. The link to the video can be found in our show notes, but the basic idea is as follows. The founder and CEO of Marching Health, Dr. Elliot Cleveland, allegedly clicked like on several posts across several social media platforms. These posts were defending the conduct of Immigration and Customs Enforcement personnel, which resulted in the murders of Renee Nicole Good and Alex Preddy in Minneapolis back in January, as well as ICE's stated reasoning for being in Minnesota in the first place, including some fairly racial slur-laden remarks about the very extensive Somali community in the state of Minnesota. Almost immediately after being released from the DCI contract, the Marching Health Company deactivated all its Instagram accounts in order to mitigate potential backlash. All of the company's social media accounts subsequently were deactivated, and Marching Health's website appears to be gone as well. Online commentary being what it is, very quickly the conversation turned to the subject of cancel culture. That's the term that arose some years ago to describe, perhaps somewhat simplistically, the phenomenon of someone saying something that someone else doesn't care for or agree with and subsequently being canceled, or having one's professional career taken away or similar. It used to be called blacklisting, and much more recently, we have seen the rise of the acronym FAFO. Dear listener, I trust you know what that acronym means. The Funliner Productions video asks, in essence, is this a case of cancel culture? Is this a violation of the Marching Health Company's constitutional protections? And then the video goes a long way toward pointing out that DCI is a private organization and had set up a set of standards of conduct for its contractors and partners. The freedom of speech protections of the First Amendment don't apply. A private organization can decide a lot of stuff having to do with freedom of expression, and there's not a lot that can be done about that. Let's go to the actual First Amendment, shall we? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's it. A constraint on Congress. That's the tweet. I feel like there ought to have been some Schoolhouse Rock music playing behind that. Anyway, Drum Corps International clearly does not wish to be associated with someone who appears to express opinions that run counter to its beliefs and policies. That is their right. You want a little more freedom of speech? Friends, I give you the internet comment section. Commenters on the Funliner Productions video indeed held forth. Some examples of this included, quote, DCI and the marching arts are and mostly have been an inclusive space, and I think it's pretty clear that the performers in the space recognize this too, and there's no room for behavior like this, especially from health practitioners working in this space. Thanks for taking such a hard stance. Quote, all I will say is a lot of DCI members would be targeted by the regime. When a company sides with the regime with no regard to the members, the best option is to cut ties. Quote, I wouldn't want anyone who likes posts about innocent people getting murdered around any kids I had. You're free to speak your mind. You are not free from the consequences. Quote, regardless of your opinion, ICE could impact DCI in a drastic way. The point of DCI is for a group of people to commit to a shared goal, and that opportunity is why DCI is so important. I'm sure there are many people of different races and ethnicities in the activity who can be impacted by ICE. Give it some thought. Quote, people who have been saying, he got canceled just because he liked some posts, don't realize it's more than just liking posts. What you like or agree with on social media is reflective of your morals and views, and what this person liked wasn't just some simple humor of social media posts. It's posts in direct support of the ICE murders that were committed, possible racist ideologies, and disinformation. Like a previous commenter said, you wouldn't want someone with these morals to continue to partner with an organization that includes members from all different backgrounds, would you? On the other hand, or OTOH as the acronym goes, one commenter wrote, quote, this is just one more step in the nation fracturing and heading to a dark, dark place. Canceling each other for political opinions is antithetical to free speech. People need to learn to work with others they disagree with, or it's only going to get worse. Okay, here's where I join the chat, or rather the comment section. I didn't post these thoughts, but they did come to mind as I read that last one. Here's the thing. We're already a nation fractured. We're already in a dark place. As the great philosopher Austin Powers once said, that train has sailed. We've seen what happens when you try to work with fascists. The name Neville Chamberlain has only one historical connotation. Which leads me deftly to one of my favorite philosophical concepts. Not really, I have some. I wasn't a philosophy major, but there are just some ideas that stick with you. The paradox of tolerance is a philosophical concept suggesting that if a society extends tolerance to those who are intolerant, it risks enabling the eventual dominance of intolerance, thereby undermining the very principle of tolerance. This paradox was articulated by the philosopher Karl Popper in 1945. He argued that a truly tolerant society must retain the right to deny tolerance to those who promote intolerance. Popper posited that if intolerant ideologies are allowed unchecked expression, they could exploit open society values to erode or destroy tolerance itself through authoritarian or oppressive practices. This paradox does raise complex issues surrounding the limits of freedom, especially concerning free speech and the protection of liberal democratic values. It has implications for contemporary debates on managing hate speech, political violence, political extremism, and social policies aimed at fostering inclusivity without compromising the integrity of democratic tolerance. My friends, in this first and second strain, the second of which has typically been full of my little opinions, I offer you this little opinion. Couldn't have said all that better myself. Marching arts organizations have the responsibility of taking care of their members. At any given moment, a band or drum corps may contain people of color, people of various sexual orientations and gender identities. In short, any or all of the various kinds of people who at this moment are being actively threatened by our federal government. If I were the head of such a marching arts organization, in no way would I want to place any members of that organization in the position of having to deal with someone who clicked like on a social media post which condones the behaviors of fascists or their paramilitary enforcement militia. There are folks who will suggest that clicking like on a social media post doesn't necessarily mean you actually agree with the sentiment contained in it. Maybe you appreciated the elegance with which the sentiment was expressed, or the font in which it was displayed, or maybe you were congratulating the poster on their very first social media post. Welcome to the party. Semantics. Pedantic semantics. Come on. If you click like, you endorse that post, everything in it. And thanks to the simple, some would say simplistic, nature of the little thumbs up emoji, there's no nuance. There are no subdivisions of a thumbs up. By clicking like or thumbs down or angry face or whatever in response to a social media post, you tell people at least a little something about what you believe, about what you support, about what you like. As another wise philosopher once suggested, well, if it isn't the consequences of my own actions. The First Amendment to the Constitution validates your claim to freedom of speech. It doesn't validate your claim to freedom from consequences. He's doing his Keith Olbermann impression again. That's news and notes from and opinions about the band world. If you have a news item you think should be included in this segment, send me a link via email to heybandwagon@yahoo.com. All right, let's observe a grand pause. And on the other side of that, I've got a conversation for you that will blow your mind. Hope you'll stick around. Okay, let's change keys and get into the trio section. In this episode's trio section, as I mentioned in the episode's open, the conversation I'm about to have was the result of popular demand. A couple of months ago, my social media feed suddenly kind of blew up, and quite a lot of my band friends shared a post by the UMass Amherst Alumni Association about a distinguished alum, and those shares either implied or expressed outright the question, so when are you going to interview this person for the podcast? So a little belatedly, since I genuinely am not sure where the month of January even went, I am pleased to be joined by someone who has used their band powers for good, and I'm going to encourage her to tell that story, as well as any others she'd like to. Please help me welcome to the program, Megan Kreiner. Megan, great to meet you.
Oh my gosh, well, thank you for having me.
So before I yield the floor to this most recent dang cool project of yours, as well as lots of other ones as well, who knows, I will open this conversation as I traditionally have done with a few band-oriented questions so people can get a sense of who they're listening to, at least through a band lens or a band filter. So what is your primary instrument?
I can still claim it's still French horn. I will break it out every once in a while. And we have a lot of studio musicians around here, so you can usually find someone that'll give you a lesson if you need a refresher course. But French horn was my main one. And I did a lot of trumpet also because I was doing hoop band. But yeah, French horn.
It will become clear, my dear listeners, where in the world she is, but we'll hold that for a moment. Megan, how did you get into playing that instrument or those instruments?
In fifth grade, we had actually moved. My family originally was from Queens Village, and we moved to Garden City, which is a town in Long Island, and with a far more established music program. So we were given the option to pick instruments. I, for whatever reason, loved gravitating towards projects where it was very male dominated. I don't know what that was about it, but I loved being the only girl or one of two girls in an activity. And the trumpet section was certainly that. And I don't know if it was this weird little hang up I had on proving myself that I could be just as good as my male counterparts, but I really love the idea of playing trumpet. I also love the idea that, when you're first starting out in band, it's the brass instruments you can kind of make out during a concert anyway. And I felt like, what was the point of learning an instrument if you couldn't hear it? So trumpet was my first one. And I started there in fifth grade. And then I think maybe around seventh grade, I picked up French horn. And my trumpet teacher played both instruments. And he had made the recommendation that perhaps French horn would be a good instrument to kind of break off to, because it was a more challenging. And I mean, in those days, 90s, early 2000s, my understanding, at least of popular culture music, movie music, is that the French horns always had the most amazing solos, thanks to John Williams. So that also seemed like a really fun thing to do. So yeah, after that, I was doing French horn in high school, and those instruments traveled with me to college.
What bands have you been active with in your life, knowing that band is not your gig for a living?
Well, when I was in high school, I played in all the various ensembles that we had at school. So I was French horn mostly in our symphony bands. We didn't really have wind instruments in our orchestras, but we had opportunities to do the NISMA contest, which was our adjudicated trials, where then you could become part of the all-state and all-Eastern bands. And my senior year, I did participate in the all-Eastern band. I would also say that my musical experience also provided me with a lot of my very established lifestyle, so to speak, in that I went to participate in the New York Summer School of the Arts program. In that time, it was being hosted at Skidmore College, and I was the standby French horn. I didn't even make it into initially, and when I got there, I auditioned and got their principal position. So I don't think maybe that landed so well for some of the more established musicians, but I was thrilled. And I even met my boyfriend, which then down the road became my husband. He was bassoonist. So I can definitely credit music with providing me with my personal life experiences very much established there. So I had summer school of the arts program stuff. And then when I got to college, marching band was a big part of it. I had done marching band in high school, and then I really wanted that marching band experience in college just because it was fun, and the band kids are always the ones I liked hanging out with. It's a certain, genre of people that I've always gravitated towards, that collaborative, artistic, energy that I always wanted to seek out. So I think that's in general, when you're younger, the music programs are kind of a perfect fit for that, where if you want to surround yourself with those like-minded and people that love arts and love music, there's always the theater group and there's the band. So, and I did both.
Now, ordinarily at this point, I ask my guest, what's your current band-related role? And it's sort of a big asterisk in your case. That UMass Alumni Association Facebook post I was bombarded with began by saying, ever wonder what it takes to make a herd of wildebeests march in perfect formation? And you have accomplished that, but you are not an employee of a zoo or anything. And the homework I've done suggests to me that you were not a veterinary science major either. So for folks who may have no idea what I'm going on about, or even for folks who do, what was that Alumni Association post talking about?
So that was talking about our recent movie release of Zootopia 2, in which I was animating on. And in this particular instance, I was able to leverage my experience as a member of the marching band into the sequence that included a marching band that was primarily comprised of wildebeests marching with their instruments. So it was a really fun opportunity to kind of dust off that knowledge, that institutional knowledge that I had to make sure that I was trying my best to include as much specificity as possible, because if I know anything about people in the arts, when they see any kind of representation of what they're into, especially when it comes to, for whatever reason, animated movies in particular, they get super picky. So I really wanted to make sure that I was, I guess, doing my fellow band members proud by making sure that I was trying to keep those wildebeest as accurate as possible.
A great many of my listeners I know are the people who look at either the print ads in, say, the Macy's Christmas flyer, or look at a movie or a TV show, the movie Drumline, the movie Mr. Holland's Opus, that sort of thing, and point to some very specific things that they could easily have gotten a band creative consultant to come and help with, kind of thing. Would you judge that on this project, and this was through the Disney Animation Studios, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Would you judge that you were the only person working on the project that had that band experience, or were there anybody else who had any remote clue about what details you were talking about?
Surprisingly, there are lots of people that work in my industry that have some sort of musical ability or musical background. In general, you're going to find a lot of overlap when you have people in the visual arts. Chances are they probably dabble in other parts of the arts as well. So there were quite a few people in my department, even a few of our animation leads, that also had experience. There were trombone players and other brass players. Certainly, we could probably put together at least a good small ensemble if I really wanted to take a head count. And I think when it comes to the, getting down into the nitty-gritty of detail-oriented stuff, the fortunate thing there is that when you start kind of getting into the weeds about wanting to make sure that an instrument is accurately being rigged so that you can actually move keys in a way where people would believe it, or kind of going back and forth of what's the best way to hold the tuba given the circumstances of the characters, maybe rigging limitations, you can talk to someone and they're not going to give you a weird look like,
why would you bother?
Why are you stressing about this? It's a wildebeest with a tuba. Just stick it in their hand and send it down the street. So at least I know that I won't be made to feel like I'm ridiculous for wanting it to be accurate or accurate enough.
Like a lot of things in life, but in the creative world particularly, if it's being done accurately and authentically, nobody really notices it too much. As soon as it's not, people pick up on that. So one of my favorite movies is the Blues Brothers movie, and it's hysterical, and they're all professional musicians playing in that band, but you look at them and the guy's not moving the trumpet valves the way. It took me out of the movie for just a second.
Mm-hmm. Funnily enough, our directors were actually trombone players, and they would bring their trombones with them on occasion, just as a lark. They would play, they would riff sometimes in our sweatbox sessions. They might, give someone a little fanfare if they did really well, just for the purposes of fun. In particular, I know that when I was working with the marching band, we had trombones in there. And because it was such a concentrated production, the time we normally would have to animate was greatly truncated by just kind of the extenuating circumstances of Moana 2 getting pushed up into production into a full feature. It had originally been intended to be an episodic television show, and when it got switched into feature mode, it kind of pulled resources and time that we would have been spending on Zootopia. So that meant we had to kind of go without for a few things, and kind of pick our battles. And one battle that I was kind of trying to pick was making sure the instruments were rigged. And some of them you could kind of fake it, like with a trumpet, you had really big hooves, so you can kind of maybe not see if the valves were going down. But with the trombones, that felt a little more obvious that the slides weren't working. So that was something I had to ask nicely for if we could possibly at least rig them, in particular because I thought if anyone was going to be annoyed that they weren't working right, it was going to be the two trombone playing directors.
There you go.
Yeah. So
I was going to ask if there were adjustments that you needed to make in the basic design of the wildebeest characters so that they could properly appear to be playing the instruments. I mean, apart from all the Disney movies anthropomorphize the animals to a certain extent. Yeah. But I got looking at the extra big teeth on the wildebeests and thinking, well, that's going to be a brass player's problem. So I was prepared to check in. You beat me to it, but I was prepared to check in and wonder what kind of artistic license you had to take in order to kind of make some things work.
I mean, bearing in mind, first off, our wildebeests had hands that really only comprised of two main hooves and a little thumb hoof. Yeah. So I was already in trouble pretty much with trumpets because there's 3 keys there. And then, the rest of the instruments, flutes and saxophones, obviously plenty of keys there as well. There is like a shot or two where you get really close to the band so you can absolutely see if they're playing properly. And that was like the really big one that I wanted to make sure was really accurate. So I made sure to, actually, let me back up a little bit. Our wildebeests, obviously there's a lot there. I didn't animate individually all 50 or 60 that appear on screen. The wildebeest were crowd assets. So in this instance, it works a little differently from our character assets. For a crowd asset, you're animating the performance kind of outside of the shot with the intent that our crowds department will then take that animated asset and duplicate it, so that you can have 2 rows of trumpet players and they'll all pretty much be doing the same thing.
So maybe not as complicated as copy and paste, but
on the most simplistic level, it's that. But then obviously, we're talking, they're still animated assets and it can get quite heavy, with that sort of thing. So because there are so many characters, oftentimes with crowds and characters that are rigged specifically for crowds, it's a slightly lighter version of the amount of rigging and specificity that we might have on a main character like Nick or Judy. It's an attempt to make it a little easier to put it through the pipeline, but then you also have to cheat things on occasion because there might be limitations in that rig. So for example, with our wildebeest's face, there was a limited amount of lip rig that I could work with that would actually travel through our cycle and our crowd pipeline. So it is fortunate in a way that these characters are at least a little further back from the camera as well. And you're not going to necessarily see that the lips might not be perfectly fitted onto the mouthpieces, for example. And there's other things you can do to kind of guarantee that everything is going to sit correctly and a hand isn't going to go through a key and the mouthpiece isn't going to the mouth. In animation, we have something called parenting, and you can kind of pick and choose what's going to drive the animation. So for our tuba players, for example, the tuba would have been animated and parented to the main body. So the body and the tuba are going to move pretty much in sync with each other. And then the body parts that would have to make contact with the tuba, like the hand or the face, I would actually parent those to the tuba. So as the tuba kind of bounces around, the head will follow it and the hands will follow it. And then I can just animate the fingers separately and I can animate the cheeks. So you have to have a battle plan for each instrument to decide, well, is it the head that's going to drive the animation on the instrument, or is it going to be the instrument that's driving the head? So you're picking and choosing what you want to do there. For the shots that are close up, though, there's a little more wiggle room in that. For those characters, those were actually treated more like character animation rigs. So I could animate those in the shot. I could very specifically pose things to the camera, and I could add extra rigs, which is a really cool part of our pipeline, in that you can add a little more animation ability where you need it. So for example, where a wildebeest face was lining up on a mouthpiece, I could sculpt the lips to really fit around it. And fortunately, since I played brass, I know that your front mouth isn't going to move once it's there. It's really all on the sides. So then I would have to go and deal with the sides. But I knew at least if I had a good plant on the front, that I would be okay and I could kind of work around. So there, as I said, there's that one shot where you get pretty close to the wildebeest and you can really see them playing. And there's a trumpet player that kind of blasts off a note. And that was the shot I would say I was really kind of leaning into my understanding of, how the instrument's supposed to work and knowing where the breath support and how the breath was going to be brought in, and that you're not supposed to take your whole face off of the instrument. And even the fingerings, I would trying really hard to make sure I had them playing the correct notes. I had temp music that I sent through a few programs to break the temp music into their separate tracks. I found people at work that played flute and clarinet and saxophone, and I gave them sheet music that I grabbed off of that and had them play for me so I could at least see what the fingering was and what they were doing. You can barely see it, but it's there. It's there. It's as best to my ability that it's in the marching band, and in particular, it's in the credit section because the marching band shows up again, and I animated those too.
Oh,
And it's in the credit section that those were all people that I had to bring in to play their instruments for me so that I knew what the instruments were supposed to be doing as the music was playing. So, as you said, if it's right, it's going to go somewhat unnoticed, but if it's wrong, that's when people like to
yeah.
take to the message boards and complain that why couldn't they just find somebody to go in there and tell them at least how to a trumpet player is supposed to take a breath. So
Because somebody has to complain. It's kind of a
somebody's
rule.
got to complain. Yeah.
I
I know very specifically and having been in the UMass marching band that our drum line was always extremely particular about how they went about their methodology and how they played. Even the cymbal players, I know some super hardcore cymbal players that tried really hard to make sure that they were very, very excellent with their craft, and that involved, positioning and how you go about playing the cymbal and the bass drum and how you go about, playing with the sticks. How far they come off of the
yeah,
instrument
yeah.
and what happens if there's a click, where does that go? So, and are you playing with both sticks at the same time or just one or the other? And these drum guys, they're really far back in the credits. So, but you do see them go by, and I definitely consulted with percussionist and cymbal player, and I looked at footage online. I know what I'm looking for at least. And that was the thing. Like, even if I didn't know how to play the instrument and I couldn't find a cymbal player to play for me, I knew what was right when I saw it at
Hmm.
least. So,
Hmm.
video reference was obviously a big, big thing that we were looking for as well.
Now, I took a quick tour through your LinkedIn page. As I did, I got looking at your various credits, and amongst them are interesting sounding roles like character animator, which I bet people can guess what that is, and cleanup animator. And
Mhm.
in betweening, I stand ready to be enlightened about what all that means, including a term that you threw out early on that I'm interested to know. I have a pretty bad idea. I mean, I have a good idea, and it's probably wrong about what a sweatbox session is.
Ah, okay. Sure. Yeah, so I'll just go over those terms first. So 2D and cleanup and stuff like that. That's old school. That's real old school. When I first got to UMass, I was going to pursue animation. They told me that they had animation set up in the department. It was kind of difficult for me to find it on the East Coast. Animation programs and stuff kind of attached to that particular industry. And in that time, Googling for colleges and stuff wasn't really a thing just
Yeah.
yet. And because I actually wasn't entirely sure I wanted to do art versus music, I was still a little on the fence on it. I wanted to be in a place where at least if I had to make the switch, I didn't have to leave the school. I could just switch over. So I did minor in music when I was at UMass. I minored in French horn and completed a BFA. I had a fine arts degree and art history on the side just because we had to take so many anyway. It was like, oh, I'll take two more and I'll get a minor. I really had intentions to pursue 2D animation. I wanted to draw. I wanted to learn how to do that. And it was around the time, early 2000s, where 3D was kind of making a huge splash and 2D just wasn't happening anymore. Eisner had kind of cleaned out the animation department at Disney. So, of course, when I hit the market looking for work, it was a flood of Disney animators all looking for work as well because they had been put out, and the ones that had
Mm,
retrained at least were going back and trying to find work again. So it wasn't great competition wise. But I had always loved drawing, and I was a little sad that I had to kind of acquiesce and go straight into computers. I didn't really get a chance to learn how to do 2D animation properly. So when I was at Disney, around the time we were wrapping up on Strange World, I was going to complete my contract. So I was contractually there for about 30-ish months or so, and I had been there pretty much since Raya. And because I was going to roll off, I wanted to find out if I could get a little extra training in 2D because I figured it was now or never. And plus, for anyone who is familiar with how 2D works, usually there's a very big piece of furniture involved with this. It's this animation desk. It involves a large plexiglass circle that it sits is inset into a large cutout on a drafting board pretty much. And it's got a light behind it. There's a little pegboard to hold your pages in place. It's massive. And I have a folding one myself now, but in that time period, I had none of that. So I consulted with Rachel Bibb, who was the head of our 2D cleanup folks, and she's been there for quite a few movies and was amazingly generous with her time in that she allowed me to do the training that they had set up for apprentice 2D animators that would come through the studio. And that would pretty much meant that they hand you a stack of what we like to refer to as roughs. And these are the drawings that are being created by our animators. as the name might imply, they're really rough. And sometimes there's pieces missing, like there's a hand missing, or they just didn't bother drawing the nose because it wasn't really important to the movement. And usually these drawings are being generated by two different types of animators. We have our key animators, our head animators, who are drawing the main poses, the big poses, like the top of a jump or like the big expression. And then there are drawings that happen between those poses being done by in-betweeners, and they're still being done rough, because everyone needs to match as best they can. And ultimately, between our key animators and our in-betweeners, you'll have a stack of drawings that will comprise your shot. These obviously are not ready for prime time. They are rough. So as cleanup artists, and for whatever reason, I felt like cleanup was at least something I could pick up faster than I could doing 2D animation work, like right off the bat. And a lot of people start in cleanup and then they graduate into in between jobs and then finally into key animation and stuff. But 2D is kind of a jumping off point for a lot of people. As a cleanup artist, you're going to take those drawings and you are going to redraw every single one of them. It is not tracing because you are sitting there with model sheets. You are filling in details that are missing. You are fixing what we refer to as spacing, which is basically just how a part of the character might be traveling through space. So as their hand, maybe wipes across the screen, you want it to be like a nice even arc or something like that. You don't want it to be jittery. You don't want it bouncing around. So you're checking all that stuff. You're checking every little bit of whatever's moving as a 2D cleanup artist. And the main goal here is to make it look like the character is being drawn by the same person. You don't want it to look like this is Jen's version of Gaston and this is Michael's version of Gaston between shots. Like, so you're there basically to tie it all together. And it's those final lines that ultimately end up on the screen. I really wanted to learn how to do that. And in order to make sure that that wasn't going to conflict with my normal duties at that point, I was doing assistant animation on Strange World. I was coming in somewhere between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. or so. I would just come into the studio and I would sit at the desk that we have in our communal area. We had an animation desk set up for anyone who wanted to kind of dabble on it. And during my lunch breaks and in this very, very late evening time, I would take these tests and I would redraw them to do cleanup. And then I would bring them to Rachel and she would do corrections. And I had maybe gotten through like 2.5 tests or something by the time I had finished. And around that time, Once Upon a Studio was getting kicked into production. And the big thing about Once Upon a Studio is that it was kind of a love letter to Disney and the art of Disney. And our directors were really adamant that they wanted old school 2D animation being done on this, like full out. What makes that a little tricky is that Disney doesn't really have a bevy of 2D animators and cleanup artists like ready to go. They keep a few on staff, but on a larger project, they are oftentimes, they're not going to have the people that are just readily available because we mostly do 3D. In this instance, all the cleanup work was going to be handed off to a small boutique studio in Altadena, California, called Creative Capers. So I was told to old school go over there with my cleanup tests, knock on their door and say, hey, I'm doing cleanup tests at Disney. Do you need help on this thing coming up? It was the most, I mean, who does that now to get a job? But because Creative Capers does the majority of what they refer to as legacy work. So if you see, for example, a 2D animation appearing a lot of times now in like on the cruise ships or in the Imagineering projects and the rides, Capers probably had something to do with it. Like, for example, if you go to Epcot and you have the Beauty and the Beast sing-along, Capers was the ones that actually worked on those little cutscenes that were added to the original footage of Beauty and the Beast, for example. Because Capers often employs and they bring back in the people that had been the 2D artists that had worked in industry before, kind of made the switch over to 3D. So they took me on. I was the greenest of all their 2D animators, 2D cleanup artists. It was a very surreal experience because they were hiring in people or bringing big people back that had worked on these pictures. Like I had cleanup artists working with me that had done Hercules and Hunchback and Little Mermaid, and there I am sitting there just trying to keep up. And so I wasn't as fast, but I I'm in my 40s now, and I was the young person there, which was a very weird thing to be. That was a long description. So that's what a 2D cleanup artist is, and an in-betweener, and those are kind of more older terminologies. We have digital versions of these now. We have software where you can do the cleanup and the rough animation all on the same software, and you're usually using a Cintiq, like a large tablet. But as an art form, it's kind of, it holds water. It's the same idea. And at least what I found was that after I'd done the 2D cleanup work, that my 3D animation improved a lot, because now you're thinking in terms of flat shapes and silhouette, and you're not depending on a computer to track your arcs, which is what we like to call when we're just making sure that, something is flowing through your shot in a nice, even path. The computer will do that for you, but if you have to draw it by hand, you're definitely checking it and making sure that, that hand is going to travel through in a lovely arc and not bounce around or something like that. The computer can easily bounce it around for you and you might not even notice. So yeah, that's what that weird little side quest was, and how it shows up on my IMDb page now.
And again, my head is spinning because this is just fascinating to me. Not only as a behind the scenes sort of a person, but I'm the kind of a person that they have to kick out of the movie theater because I'm sitting there watching the credits as they go by.
As you should. You should
But
absolutely watch the credits, because then if you don't, you sometimes you miss the little stingers at the end.
true, but the movies that I tend to go to, which are on the, should we say, special effects heavy side, I will sit there and watch, and dozens and dozens and dozens of names will go by, and I'll
Mhm.
look at it and say, I am quite certain that that took a lot of work from a lot of people, but I don't know what kind of work that is. So this has been real interesting to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit. And so at this point, I mean, you've been there for 20 years,
Yeah.
something like that.
I graduated in 2003.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've been kicking around here for a little bit now.
Do you get to claim that you're the head of a department, or
Oh
put it
no.
this way, if I sit there and watch the credits, is your name bigger than anybody else's?
No, 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 no.
Oh.
Well, because my path has been very meandering through the industry. I didn't start off as an animator. I started off as a production assistant. That job I got because of my experience volunteering at the SIGGRAPH conferences, which is the computer animation graphic design conferences. That kind of became my, like, quote unquote industry experience, because inevitably everybody wants you to have experience even for an entry level job, which always struck me as very strange. Doesn't really work. But my industry experience was my time volunteering for the student volunteers. I started as a student volunteer, and then I kind of made my way into team leadership, and then managing the student volunteers as part of as part of the program department heads. And I kind of ordained myself as the person that was going to be in charge of the speakers and the donations, which provided me with a very legitimate excuse to pretty much reach out to every studio. And they had to talk to me because I was there, to better the student experience. And I very much kept it in that lane. I didn't make it hey, let's talk students, and then, oh, by the way, can you do this for me, type of thing. Because I knew that I needed to establish rapport, and I needed to prove that I had this management, like production management capability. So that became my in. And my first job was as a production assistant at Sony ImageWorks on the open season feature. And because I had my actual degree in computer graphics at UMass, I had experience in the platform that they were animating in, which was Maya at the time. So I was able to, with the blessing of my really amazing supervisor, James Williams, I was able to sneak in some work on the movie itself. I ended up doing, I think, a very short sequence as a layout, doing it as a layout, because I was the layout department's PA. So I kind of started there, and I did these little odd things on the side, but that was enough. That gave me enough material to put on a reel, which then ended up going over to DreamWorks, in which case I was then able to get a job as a layout artist at DreamWorks based on the work that I had been sneaking at Sony. And funnily enough, when I was there interviewing, I interviewed with Gil Zimmerman, and surprisingly, he was a trombonist who knew my husband because my husband was a bassoonist and he was working out there. So I was able to once again leverage the musical community to make
Awesome.
an inroad on something. So it was a very, very weird little happenstance. But yeah, Gil was the supervisor for a little movie called How to Train Your Dragon. So that was my first layout experience, and
Hmm.
I did, and layout's pretty much your set dresser. At least my portion of layout was as like a set dresser, and I would set cameras up. And to just give a little more context for layout, oftentimes at animated studios, layout's kind of split into two sub departments. You have previs or rough layout, and then you have final layout. And animation kind of sits in the middle. Previs is basically converting or translating 2D storyboards into kind of a rough 3D representation. So they're putting really blocky characters in, temporary effects, camera motion, just so that the directors can quickly get a quick and dirty feeling of, does this work in a 3D environment timing wise? Are we giving it enough time? Once that's kind of nailed down and Previs is able to create this rough version of what the final movie might look like, the shots then travel through the pipeline and hit the other departments. So animation will then pick up that rough version of the shot and put in the final characters and the final animation and whatever else they might need. And anyone else that needs to kind of get in there and do stuff can work in that shot. But once that animation's in, the shot will eventually end up in a final layout department where you're making sure that there's set continuity, like the cup that's in this shot will show up in the next shot and not disappear over the cut, or that the characters have the props they need and the correct versions of them. So there's a lot of continuity checking in final layout, as well as camera cleanup. So not only like prop master, but you're also the cinematographer. So if animation has changed something, whatever they're animating is obviously going to look different from what Previs put in. And a big thing that the cinematographer will do, as a cinematographer, when we put that hat on, is that we'll oftentimes try to treat the camera as if there is a person behind it. So we might animate in a little delay or a little bit of breathing, just so that it doesn't feel like a very sterile, digitally provided camera. So that was the department I ended up in. From there, I then took some online classes and ended up finally getting into the animation side of things. And my first crowd animated movie was Turbo, which was that racing snail movie. It was, I think, what we refer to as Jeffrey's Ratatouille. And I ended up doing that for quite a while. It was a lot longer than I think I really had wanted to stay in that department. And I think when it comes to any sort of career in the arts, if you get stuck, you risk stagnating, and that's dangerous.
A version of typecasting.
Yeah, exactly. And there's only so many times you want to make a walk cycle before you start getting really frustrated that you aren't really being afforded the opportunities to kind of push your animation, push yourself. Because as a crowd animator, you're working with the extras. You don't want your extra to stick out. You want it to feel like it is a natural part of the environment and it's there to support the busyness and the richness of the world building. It's not supposed to be drawing attention though. So it was,
yeah, it has to be a little bit bland.
You had an opportunity every once in a while to plus something, in which case maybe for How to Train Your Dragon 2, for example, we were animating all the dragons in the background, and they were fun. I loved working with them. They were so much better than people. Because you could imbue them with animalistic traits, which was great. I loved working with the natters in particular because I could look at bird footage and then add that to their behaviors. And at least it was a little more unique than a walk cycle. So I was doing that, and I think I did that for like 8 years or something like that. And I got to the point where I couldn't sit there and do it anymore. And I ended up sending a reel to Disney. They had an opening in their associate animator, assistant animator program, which is crowds. Again, all the studios have different, names for these things. But my understanding, at least, was that Disney was a lot more flexible and more encouraging in the idea that you would do it for maybe 1 or 2 movies, but then the hope was that you were going to build a skill set and move on to character animation. So, and that's what I wanted. But the trade-off there was I had a good solid almost 12 years at DreamWorks with uninterrupted work, and that's a rarity in the industry nowadays. And I knew that Disney was less likely to have open positions for long-term hiring. So I was going to have to accept the fact that I was going to be on films for a contracted amount of time, and then I'd have to leave, and then hopefully I would come back and do the next film. So I decided that was worth that trade-off, and went to Disney. And you can see on the reel and on the IMDb, you know, I did some assistant animation work, and then I did make the jump into character animation, and then kind of made that weird left turn into 2D stuff. Ultimately, I ended up even being on Moana 2, and I was cleaning up Maui tattoos, which was a lot of fun. So my last film was Zootopia 2. And because I've traveled the very scenic route to get from PA to animator, I haven't supervised, and that's been fine. I appreciate the experiences that I've been able to pick up along the way, because it's always surprising when that stuff becomes really relevant. The 2D stuff saved me from possibly not working on Moana 2 at all, because at the time we were sharing the production load with Vancouver, so they weren't hiring as many character animators in Disney Burbank at the time. So having that 2D skill set was what got me back on the show. So it's always, experiences are always valuable, even if they're not particularly good ones, because you never know when it could be really serve to your advantage down the road.
I love to learn about any old thing that I didn't know about. And this is assuredly counted as that. And there's another area of your life, which is probably a different podcast, and we can put links to it anyway, but it's the crocheting world. You're a published author. You've written umpteen books about
Yeah,
this sort of
umpteen
thing.
books. The crochet stuff was more of a cathartic exercise. So I did mention that, you know, I was doing crowd animation for, I think maybe I would define it as a slightly unseemly amount of time. I was doing a lot of crowd work, and it became really difficult to give 110% when I was coming into work, because I was like, oh, another walk cycle. Oh, you know, I'm still stuck here, and I'm not getting to do more than this. The very nature of the work that we do as creatives, when you are in a commercial industry in particular, is that you're taking notes, a lot of notes, and you know that vision that you're putting up there is the interpretation of what you are hearing from your supervisors and from your directors and from your art directors. And ultimately that's not really you up there, that's you assisting in someone else's vision. That's how it works. You know, you are there in a creative supportive role, and there's only so much fulfillment and satisfaction I think one can get from watching your character walk across the screen and stop and keep walking and whatnot. I felt like I really needed something that I could creatively own and creatively call my own, to kind of scratch that itch that I was dealing with, so that I could come to work every day and, you know, pretty much say, whatever you guys want, however you want him to walk, however you want him to run, I'm gonna give you 110%, and then during lunch I'm gonna do something that's me.
Yeah.
And I don't need to take a director's note, and I don't need to take a supervisory note. And because the nature of the crochet work that I do, which is toy building and toy patterns, I think there's a lovely intersection there that happens between working in a 3D environment digitally and then working doing these weird little 3D prints analog style. You know, I'm very used to looking at things that are what we refer to in the wireframe, so you can kind of see where all of the rows and columns kind of line up to build these characters. And even in the process of modeling things, oftentimes, especially in previs, these characters are very like Michelin Man looking. Like oftentimes they'll just be a bunch of geometric shapes kind of shoved together,
Yeah, Legos.
and
Yeah.
exactly. And that's for the sake of speed. If you shove a couple of, you know, low polygonal shapes together, like a bunch of circles, yeah, you know, sure, that's that character. It looks close enough. I get it. And like they'll paint a face on and whatever. And then I can go about my business and quickly animate it and stuff because it's light. In building these crochet toys, there was a lot of overlap. Like I was looking for simple shapes. For the most part, with when you're crocheting or even knitting, you're working in rows, you're working in the round. So you know, I could sit there and I could visualize, and I would sit there and I would draw out my characters first that I wanted to build, and I would draw them to scale, so I'd have something to kind of hold my work up to and say like, yeah, that's about right, or I need a few more rows here, or it needs to be a little wider. In terms of getting the books actually published, I'm like a little embarrassed with the ease that it happened for me. It's not really supposed to be that easy. I literally sent a box of samples to Martingale with a like, hey, I've got these and I got some drawings and I'd like to do a book. And it was still kind of early on. Amigurumi was just kind of coming into its own. So my first books, my like crochet zoo books, really simplistic looking stuff, but I was doing it by design and assuming that these were really simple shapes, beginners could do this, and they were shapes that were getting kind of borrowed between the characters, so that if you did it on the lion, then you got to the polar bear, you're like, oh, that's that leg shape that I'm already familiar with, so it's not a big deal. And the idea was to kind of make it not feel so, make it feel familiar so that it feels easy and not intimidating.
You're sort of building a vocabulary in some sense.
Yeah, exactly. So you and I think that's kind of how really any technology works. You want to start with the little tutorial, the little hand-holding tutorial where you, even if you're struggling through it, it's so short that you can kind of muscle through it and then you have something and it's done. And as a parent of really young kids at that time, the idea that I could like quickly crochet a leg and put it down and then deal with kids and then come back and crochet another leg, I didn't feel like it was quite the same as trying to be working through like a scarf and then having to stop in the middle of it and forget where the heck I was in the pattern. So I felt like bite-size interaction, or that bite-size mentality, was really helpful for me. So that was kind of what I was putting into my pattern work. And I didn't hear back from Martingale for a while. And I think I sent them an email or something, said like, hey, I sent you a box. Do you have it? Like, did you open the box? And they're like, oh, we'll check and check. And like, I want to say an hour later, I got an email back. So I'm like, oh yeah, we opened your box. Are you interested? I was like, sure. So book. And as I said, that's not really how it's supposed to work, but it worked out, that way for me at least. And I think being a part of the movie building experience and understanding pipeline was really helpful, especially the world building piece of it, because when I write my books, at least I really try to keep all of that sensibility intact. The idea that, if I'm building a collection of animals, they all should look like they belong to each other. And I want to make sure that there's enough there that imaginative play, when kids finally get a hold of it, feels like it's very complete. Like there's enough there for them to tell a story with it. And so that's kind of the modeling I used when I was building my books and my patterns. And, in general, it's a funny thing, but you'd be surprised how few parents are in this industry and how few, even fewer women are in this industry. An industry that is very specifically making a family-oriented type of product. And that experience of, would I take my kid to see this? Would I let my kid play with these? That sort of stuff really weighs heavily in my mind whenever I'm working on anything, or if I'm considering story or considering what my characters are doing over the projects that I'm on. And getting back to kind of this original concept of how does experience kind of lend itself in weird little places to informing what we do. Marching band informing how I'm going to animate my characters. Being a parent and surviving this long in this industry is kind of a rarity. And I really appreciate that I can bring that experience in there. I wish that it was maybe a little more valued at times, because I am that audience.
So in terms of doing an interview where I thought I might learn some things that I didn't know before, this has been orders of magnitude more than I was predicting necessarily. There's been tons of fun. Before we wrap things up here, let me hit you with my usual more questions that are slightly less strictly resume based. This time the questions start with, do you have a favorite piece of band music that you've played, whether outdoors or indoors or wherever?
As I said, I'm such a nerd. Anything that's got a really good French horn solo, I'm gonna be a sucker for, because there's so much of it. And I mean, my kids know that I make my kids laugh. We'll listen to John Williams music sometimes, and I'll just whenever the French horn solo comes on, the lyrics always go French horn solo, and as you sing along to whatever it happens to be. So, being married to someone who had been a professional musician, had gone through Manhattan School of Music and Gill, and had that career, I always feel a little bad leaning so heavily into movie music and movie soundtracks, but it's really my jam. Probably a little more so than the classical music, just because I find the narrative nature of it to be really, really appealing to me. And I guess maybe that's why I like Hulse so much, because I know that John Williams borrowed a lot out of that. So yeah, anything that's got a really bombastic, cool French horn solo, I'm gonna be game for that.
180 degrees around, is there a piece of band music that you have never played that you would like to?
I'm in a place where, obviously there's a lot of studio musicians, and I would have always loved to have had a chance to play, soundtrack music. I think the Lord of the Rings soundtrack is beautiful. I think the How to Train Your Dragon,
Hmm.
soundtrack is beautiful. I've never had a chance to play those, although I have a little less excuse now because so much is available on YouTube and you can play along. Then it just becomes a matter of like, I don't have 36 hours in a day.
Is there a band that you would love to perform with that you haven't, either because you're not the right age or you're not in the right place or you don't live in the right period of time?
Ensemble wise, Hollywood Bowl Orchestra seems like a real fun place to be.
Hmm.
They got a real sweet venue. They get lots of cool celebrity guests. So, in terms of just maybe that's more location type of go for. And I mean, honestly, just even watching the footage of people in studio orchestras, which aren't set groups, obviously, they're contracted, but those always look really cool to me. And actually, just a quick aside, we can watch those sessions at Disney when we would get to that point in production where they would be recording the music. They would often stream those sessions into our common area. So we have this common area in the studio. There's a large screen there, and they have a lot of our company updates in that space. But when we are actively recording for the soundtracks, they will stream it in. So you can watch.
And my last question is always the one which could go any direction. Do you have a favorite band story that you enjoy telling?
That first performance you do, I mean, you've had your experience in high school, you come in and you work with the band, and that wall of sound that you produce is something where I think a lot of people, when you start out in a 50-piece high school band and you make that transition to 400 something people, and they're all as gung-ho as you to be
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
I think there's something really kind of warm and fuzzy about that experience where you play and you can kind of feel that little electrical signal that kind of hits as you're playing. I loved that experience, just that moment. It wasn't even necessarily about what we were playing at the time, but the feeling like you were finally in a place that was matching your intensity, need/want. Like you want it to be that intense, and you just hadn't been in a group that could deliver that just yet. So being able to be intense and not feel like you're over you're overdoing it and everyone else is just kind of showing up. So experientially, like I loved those very first performances. I remember Giant Stadium that you could from the field see the high schoolers just kind of gasp at how loud we were. And it was one of those moments where, you felt like, you were thrilling people. I would also say that John Leonard, our one of our trumpet leads, I always, for whatever reason, look back with a lot of fondness and humor when they were doing saucy Mad Libs at the gym. And what the point of this was, I want to say it was either a really clean Mad Libs story with dirty words, or maybe it was clean words and dirty Mad Libs, but there was some disconnect between the two. Therefore, what it was supposed to be clean, but said in. So anyway, the juxtaposition was what made it funny, but also the fact that they had sexy Kenny G saxophone playing along with it, accompanying it because you're in the band and you can have that sort of thing. You can have a musical background. So it was very like careless whisper going on while there was this very sultry reading of this extremely inappropriate Mad Libs poem thing that they came up with. So I look back at that with a lot of fondness.
Well, this has been a grand old time. Are there places online where people can follow what you're up to in the animation world or in the crochet world for that matter?
Right? I'm very Googleable because I'm kind of all over the place. It kind of depends, I guess, where what you're interested in. If you're interested in the crochet stuff, I have a website. It's mkcrochet.com. Or and then regards to the animation side of things, I mean, if you're interested in what I worked on, I'm on IMDb. And I think off of LinkedIn, you can find links to my demo reels and the work reels that I've done. So I've got a few out there. So if you want to see the layout work I've done, or if you want to see the 2D stuff I've done, or the 3D stuff I've done, and the crowds work, which is plenty of, that's all out there as well. I'm very searchable.
And so you can look at those reels and say, she was involved in that one, and that one, and that one. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, artist, animator, and author Megan Kreiner, great thanks to you for giving us a bit of your time and opening a window into a part of the world that this podcast assuredly had not yet peeked through.
It was a delight. Thank you so much again for having me.
Okay, we'll take a break, and then I'll return with an instant classic Randy Standy story. This is BandWagon. Here comes the dogfight. This episode's dogfight is, as promised, a story that the noted band composer Randall Standridge told by way of posting on social media last week. Quote, I had to make a really hard decision during the Texas All-State Band Clinic. Months ago, I was hired to be the conductor of the 2026 Texas ATSSB All-State Concert Band. I was very excited about this and began selecting repertoire, among which I included 2 movements of my symphony, my favorite piece I've ever written. This was matched with several other works, and the rep was set. During the last 2 days, I had the extreme pleasure of working with the ensemble, but after 2 rehearsal blocks, I realized something. We were not going to have enough time for all of the music I had selected. I wish to emphasize at this point that it was not a talent issue, but a time issue. I had simply overprogrammed for the amount of rehearsal time that we were going to have. So I started looking at where to cut. I couldn't cut any of the pieces by other composers because I did not think that would be fair. I couldn't cut Return to the Imaginarium as it was commissioned specifically for this concert. That left Animation and the Symphony. We had already read through Animation and the kids absolutely loved it. I didn't have the heart to take that piece away from them. And that left the Symphony. This is one of those moments where I had to set my own ego and wishes aside for the good of the group. Yes, it is probably true that we could have spent a lot of time and prepared the symphony, but we would have had to let all of the other pieces suffer and not be as polished. When conducting an honor band, my first priority is the student experience and their performance. Anything else, including my own ego, is completely secondary. So, instead, the personnel for the honor band were able to print off another of my works, Stay, which we were able to prepare successfully, along with all of the other works, and present a polished and effective concert. I once again wish to emphasize that the talent level of the students was not a factor in this decision. It was simply a case of the amount of repertoire not being aligned with the amount of rehearsal time available. This is honor band number 122 for me. If I'm lucky, I'll get to do a few more. For some of these students, this may be the only chance they get, and I wanted it to be a good one. To me, true leadership is an act of service, not to oneself, but to those that you are charged with leading. I try to keep this in mind every time I'm given the honor and responsibility. A big shout out to the students of the 2026 Concert All-State Band, their teachers, and to the board that invited me and helped me with this performance. It was indeed my honor and my pleasure. He's just the coolest. Okay, one last pause to catch our breath, and then we'll wrap things up for this episode. Thanks for continuing to listen. To wrap up this week, let's take the coda. For the coda. See, I knew there was a question I was going to ask Megan Kreiner, but I plumb forgot, at least while we were officially recording. Early in our chat, Megan mentioned a piece of unfamiliar animator terminology in passing, and, well, it wasn't the only unfamiliar terminology of our conversation, since she's the professional animator and I'm not. Anyway, the question I thought about asking right then and there, well, I didn't ask, because I'm polite, and I don't much like to interrupt a great paragraph by asking a dopey little question like that. She was on a roll. The question was, what in the heck is a sweatbox session? Band people being who we are, I'm betting we could all invent clever and not necessarily family-friendly pretend definitions for that term. But I found out the answer, thanks to my fine guest. In animation, a sweatbox session is a meeting where completed scenes are reviewed by the director and production team to approve or request changes. The term originated from Walt Disney's practice of critiquing animations in a small, hot theater, leading to the name Sweatbox. Megan pointed out to me that nowadays the animation studios are a bit more humane about that. The projection screens are bigger, the AC works, and there's even coffee available. And now you know. If you'd like to submit your alternate definitions for a sweatbox session, well, feel free to do that, although I can't guarantee they'll become a dogfight segment. Sorry. And that's a wrap for this episode of Bandwagon. Thanks, as always, for downloading and listening. Bandwagon was written, researched, and produced by your humble host. Musical interludes were produced by Hammerton Media from source material largely by John Philip Sousa. You can listen to at least 71 other episodes at the pod's website, heyband.podbean.com. Please give me feedback. Let me know what you like or what you think might change. You can do that using the email address heybandwagon@yahoo.com or leave a 90-second voice message by going to speakpipe.com/heybandwagon. Be aware that I do reserve the right to include your message on the podcast unless you say otherwise. Those contact links and links to this episode's news items, conversation topics, and my interview guest, Megan Kreiner, can be found in our show notes, as can a link to Bandwagon's merch store, thanks to the good folks at TeePublic. Please share the show on social media, and thank you for that. If you enjoy this podcast, please do share it in the direction of someone whom you think might not be a listener yet. Word of mouth really is the best recruiting tool. And to keep up with the podcast, just in case it should awake from its winter slumber again, subscribe to Bandwagon on the Podbean app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever fine podcasts are sold. For now, take care, stay in touch, stay in tune, and we'll do this all again, hopefully real soon. I'm Rob Hammerton. Detail, Fallout.